Long before the pyramids of Egypt cast their shadows across desert sand. Long before the marble columns of Greece gleamed white beneath the Aegean sun. Long before Rome laid a single stone along her eternal roads, the first civilization rose in a land between two rivers. Its name, in ancient Greek, means precisely that, between the rivers. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, two great arteries flowing from the snow-capped mountains of eastern Turkey southward to the Persian Gulf. This region of what is now modern Iraq was not chosen by accident. It was chosen by water, by soil, and by the slow, patient logic of history. On these sun-baked plains, humanity first gathered into cities. Here, people first pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay and called it writing. Here, the first kings established the first laws. The first priests named the first gods. And the first astronomers charted the first stars. The fundamental grammar of civilized life, the way you and I organize our world today, was written in this soil. 4,000 years before Christ. This is the story of ancient Mesopotamia. It begins around 10,000 BCE, when the last great ice age loosened its grip and the first settlers appeared in the river valleys. It ends in 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon without a fight, and 3 millennia of indigenous civilization quietly drew to a close. In between, 10,000 years of human ambition, ingenuity, faith, cruelty, beauty, and survival. 10,000 years of people trying to make sense of the world, trying to hold it together, and sometimes, magnificently, succeeding. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Civilization. 10.000 to 3.500 BCE. Imagine the world without a single city. No roads, no temples, no written word, just small bands of human beings, hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons. Following the herds, harvesting what the land offered freely and moving on. That was the world around 10,000 BCE. And then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. As the last ice age retreated, the climate of Southwest Asia began to warm. The frozen grip that had constrained human potential for millennia gradually eased across the hills and valleys surrounding the twin rivers. In this new warmth, small bands of hunter-gatherers noticed something remarkable: wild wheat and barley growing in extraordinary abundance. For countless generations, these people had carried their possessions on their backs and stayed nowhere long enough to plant roots. But now, in the places where food was most plentiful, they began to linger, season after season after season. The earliest settlements were modest, clusters of round huts made from reeds and mud at sites like Tel Meribet and Abu Huraira in what is now northern Syria. People still hunted gazelle and gathered wild pistachios. But they stayed, and staying changed everything. In the Jordan Valley, one such settlement grew into something unprecedented. Jericho, perhaps the world's oldest continuously inhabited town, emerged roughly 11,000 years ago. Its people built stone walls not merely for shelter, but for communal defense. They raised mysterious tower structures whose purpose still puzzles archaeologists today. Something was being protected, something worth protecting. Further east, at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, another remarkable community took shape. Here, people built their mud brick homes so close together that the settlement had no streets at all. Residents entered through holes in the rooftops and moved across the settlement like ants threading through a living mound. Strange as it was, it worked, and it worked because people had chosen community over solitude. The true revolution, though, was happening quietly in the fields. Through patient, generation-spanning observation, choosing which seeds to replant, which animals to keep, early farmers began to domesticate their world. Wild grass became cultivated wheat. The wild aurochs, fierce ancestors of modern cattle, were gradually tamed. Sheep, goats, and pigs followed. For the first time in human history, food was something you grew rather than found, something you raised rather than chased. This agricultural revolution spread gradually along what historians call the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land curving from the Persian Gulf up through the river valleys and around to the Mediterranean coast. It unfolded across centuries, quietly and unstoppably, and its implications were profound. For the first time, people could produce more food than they immediately needed. Surplus. That one word changes everything. Surplus meant that not everyone had to farm. Specialists emerged: potters, weavers, toolmakers, trading their craft for food. Communities became more complex, roles diversified, and society began to stratify. Around 6000 BCE, another pivotal technology appeared: pottery. Firing clay created vessels that were lightweight, watertight, and durable. Food could be stored, liquids could be transported. The pace of life changed in ways that are difficult to overstate. Then there was the question of water. In the lowland plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, rainfall was scarce, but the rivers themselves flooded annually, leaving rich silt across the floodplains. Early farmers learned to dig channels, to redirect this water deliberately to their fields. Irrigation agriculture was born, and with irrigation came a new problem. Managing it required coordination beyond the family unit. Canals needed digging, levees needed maintaining, disputes needed settling. More complex social structures were no longer optional. They were survival. Temples appeared, first as simple shrines, but growing more elaborate as communities grew larger. These became something more than places of worship. Grain flowed in, and grain flowed out. The temple was the first institution, the first structure in human society that existed independently of any single person or family. Social stratification deepened. Those who controlled the surpluses gained power. Those who interpreted the will of the gods gained authority. The rough equality of hunter-gatherer bands gave way to hierarchical communities with emerging elites. Copper, first used for decorative beads, began to be shaped into practical tools. 1,000 years later, metalworkers discovered that copper mixed with tin produced bronze, harder, stronger, more durable than anything before it. The Bronze Age had begun. Trade networks expanded across vast distances. Obsidian from Anatolian volcanoes, prized for blades sharper than any metal, traveled hundreds of miles from its source. Lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan found its way to temple ornaments on the southern plains. Shells from the Persian Gulf appeared in inland settlements far from any coast. And then, at the end of the 4th millennium BCE, in the city of Uruk, the most consequential invention in human history made its quiet debut. Temple administrators faced a problem. Their institutions had grown too complex to manage by memory alone. To solve it, they began using small clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. Over time, those tokens became marks pressed into clay tablets, simple pictographs at first. A sheep meant a sheep. Multiple marks meant multiple sheep. But gradually, the marks grew more abstract. They came to represent not just things, but sounds, concepts, ideas. Writing had been born. Chapter 2. The Rise of Sumer. Circa 3.500 to 2.300 BCE. By 3.500 BCE, the southern alluvial plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates approached the sea, had become the heartland of humanity's first true civilization. Here, among the marshy deltas and sun-scorched fields, a culture called Sumer created something the world had never seen: a network of genuine cities, each housing thousands of inhabitants within their mud brick walls. Uruk was the greatest of them. Archaeological excavations reveal a settlement that eventually covered nearly 250 hectares and may have housed up to 50,000 people at its height. At Uruk's center stood the White Temple, perched atop a towering platform that rose like a mountain from the flat plain. Its whitewashed walls gleaming in the desert sun and visible for miles in every direction. This platform, an early prototype of the classic ziggurat, was both an engineering feat and a declaration: here, the gods dwell, and here, power resides. Other urban centers rose across the landscape. Eridu, considered by Sumerian tradition to be the oldest city of all, housed a great temple complex dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and freshwater. Lagash, Kish, Nippur, and Umma grew into powerful city-states, each with its own identity, its own ruling dynasty, its own patron deity. What made Sumerian cities different from everything that came before was their diversity. Not just farmers, but metalworkers and potters, weavers and merchants, administrators and soldiers and priests, all living within the same walls, trading their labor for food and shelter. Each city's architecture reflected this social complexity: imposing temples, administrative buildings, grand houses for elites, modest quarters for commoners. By 3000 BCE, the city of featured a temple platform over 11 meters high, requiring more than 700,000 baked bricks for its construction. Someone planned that, someone organized the labor, tracked the materials, managed the timeline, and that someone needed to be recognized. Institutionalized leadership had arrived. Early governance appears to have been shared, councils of elders, assemblies of citizens. But as cities grew, religious leaders who controlled temple resources gradually assumed greater authority, becoming priest-kings. In times of crisis, a temporary military leader might be appointed. The Sumerian word for such a figure was lugal, literally, big man, and some of these big men never gave the power back. By 2900 BCE, kingship had become firmly established across most Sumerian cities. Royal tombs from this period speak volumes about how far society had traveled from its egalitarian roots. Gold vessels, elaborate jewelry, lyres decorated with hammered bull heads of gold, and something more disturbing, the skeletons of servants and soldiers, apparently sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. Even death had become an occasion for the display of power. Religion permeated every aspect of Sumerian life. The pantheon was vast. Anu, the sky god, Enlil, lord of wind and storms, Enki, master of water and wisdom, and Inanna, goddess of love and war, both. A combination the Sumerians seemed to find entirely natural. These gods were conceived as essentially human in their emotions and needs, but vastly more powerful. Temples were their earthly homes. Daily offerings of food, drink, and incense sustained the deities who might otherwise unleash flood or famine upon neglectful worshippers. The cosmos, as the Sumerians understood it, was a flat disk covered by a vault of heaven. Below lay the underworld, a gloomy realm where the spirits of the dead existed in a shadowy half-life. Unlike later religions, Sumer offered no promise of paradise for the righteous. The same dim, quiet afterlife awaited everyone, regardless of how they had lived. And yet out of this worldview came some of humanity's greatest literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of narrative fiction ever discovered, originated in tales about a historical king of Uruk who ruled around 2700 BCE. Its story follows a hero king on a desperate quest for immortality. Triggered by the death of his beloved companion Enkidu, he crosses the waters of death. He finds the one man who survived the Great Flood, and in the end, he returns home empty-handed, carrying only the knowledge that death is humanity's inevitable fate, and that the meaning of a life lies in the living of it. It is, in many ways, the first novel. Cuneiform writing continued to evolve throughout this period. By 2500 BCE, scribes were using roughly 600 different signs to write not just inventories, but letters, legal documents, medical treatises, and poetry. Schools, called tablet houses, trained boys from wealthy families. Beginning around age 7, in the years-long mastery of this complex system, scribes became powerful figures, administrators, accountants, the keepers of institutional memory. Sumerian mathematics reached remarkable sophistication. Their sexagesimal number system, based on units of 60, enabled complex calculations, fractions, areas, astronomical measurements. Every time you count 60 seconds in a minute, every time a navigator marks 360 degrees in a circle, you are using Sumerian arithmetic. The fingerprints of these ancient accountants are pressed into the fabric of your daily life. But this world of cultural brilliance existed in a landscape of near-constant political competition. City-states fought over water rights, trade routes, and boundary lines. The independent city-state system, for all its sophistication, left Mesopotamia chronically vulnerable to any force organized enough to overcome it. To the north, in the region around modern Baghdad, such a force was taking shape, a man with a name that proclaimed his own legitimacy. The true king. His name was Sargon. Asterism. Chapter 3. The Akkadian Empire. Circa 2.334 to 2.154 BCE. To the north of Sumer, another culture had been developing on the Central Plains. These people spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language entirely unrelated to Sumerian, and while they had absorbed much from their southern neighbors, they maintained their own distinct identity. Their capital, a city called Akkad, has never been definitively located by archaeologists, but it likely stood somewhere near present-day Baghdad. From that city would emerge one of the most consequential figures in the history of the ancient world. Sargon's origins are shrouded in legend. His own inscriptions claim humble beginnings, the son of a gardener. A later tradition described him as an infant set adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates. Much as the Hebrew Bible would later describe Moses. Whether those stories are literally true or mythologically constructed, what is certain is this: Sargon began his career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a servant with proximity to power and the intelligence to use it. Around 2.334 BCE, through means now lost to history, he seized that power for himself. His chief rival was Lugal-Zagassi of Umma, who had briefly unified many southern cities under his control. Their confrontation was more than a contest between ambitious men. It was a clash between two visions of political order. Lugal-Zagassi sought to maintain the traditional city-state system, with himself as paramount ruler. Sargon envisioned something entirely different, a unified territorial state under direct central control. One language, one administration, one army, one ruler, in a series of military campaigns. He won. One inscription records that he pressed his campaigns until he washed his weapons in the sea at the Persian Gulf. He then did something revolutionary. Rather than allowing conquered cities to maintain their autonomy under local dynasties paying tribute, he removed their rulers and installed loyal officials, often members of his own family, as governors. This was not a collection of tributaries acknowledging a paramount king. This was an empire. At its height, the Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, encompassing modern Iraq, Syria, parts of Turkey, and Iran. To hold this vast and diverse realm together, Sargon established Akkadian as the official imperial language, standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and taxation, and created a standing professional army. Reportedly 5,400 soldiers who, as his inscriptions put it, ate bread before him daily, loyal not to any city or temple, but to the ruler himself. Sargon ruled for approximately 56 years. When he died around 2.279 BCE, he left behind a transformed political landscape. The age of independent city-states had given way to the age of empire. His sons struggled to maintain what he had built, both dying violently, probably assassinated, but his grandson Naram-Sin proved to be the dynasty's second great ruler, extending the empire's reach in all directions and crushing rebellions with brutal efficiency. Then he did something no Mesopotamian ruler had ever dared. He declared himself a god. Previous rulers had claimed divine appointment. Naram-Sin claimed divine status. His name was written with the cuneiform sign indicating a deity. Official art depicted him wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for gods. Physically larger than his soldiers, trampling defeated enemies underfoot. The visual language of superhuman power had been invented. It would be borrowed by every ambitious ruler in the ancient Near East for centuries to come. Yet the grandeur of his achievement concealed the fracture lines in the imperial project. Controlling vast territories with ancient transportation and communication was inherently fragile. Provincial governors accumulated their own power. Constant campaigns strained the economy. Mountain peoples called the Gutians pressed from the east. After Naram-Sin's death around 2.218 BCE, his successors watched the edifice crack. Provincial areas broke away. Around 2.154 BCE, the last ruler of the dynasty was overthrown, and the empire collapsed. The Akkadian Empire had lasted less than 2 centuries, but its legacy proved far more durable than its political structures. The concept of a unified territorial state under central rule, the very idea of empire, had entered human political consciousness. It would never leave. Later rulers, including Assyrian kings nearly 2,000 years afterward, would invoke Sargon's name to legitimize their own ambitions. The template had been set. The question now was, who would use it next? Chapter 4. The Neo-Sumerian Revival. Circa 2.112 to 2.004 BCE. After the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamia fractured. The Gutian mountain people seized control of the north. Though they never established sophisticated governing structures, their rule was characterized by raids and tribute collection rather than administration. In the south, the ancient city-states reasserted their independence. A period of disunity settled over the land, lasting nearly a century. But something remarkable was happening in the south during those years of fragmentation. Freed from imperial control, and drawing on the cultural synthesis that had developed under Akkadian rule, the old Sumerian cities experienced a creative renaissance. Scholars call this the Neo-Sumerian period, the revitalization of older cultural forms within new political structures. Among the resurgent cities, Lagash achieved particular brilliance under a ruler named Gudea. He never attempted to build a territorial empire. His ambition ran in a different direction entirely, toward temples, art, and devotion. Dozens of statues depicting Gudea have survived the millennia, carved from hard diorite stone imported from distant lands, showing the ruler in poses of prayer with hands clasped and eyes open and serene. They are among the most beautiful sculptures from the ancient world, and they tell us something important: power, in this Renaissance, was expressed not through conquest but through piety. His inscriptions describe elaborate temple building projects directed by divine instruction. In one text, he recounts a dream in which the god Ningirsu appeared to him with architectural plans, specifying every detail of the temple's construction. It is one of the most extensive religious texts of the period, a reminder that for the Sumerians, the boundary between the sacred and the practical was extremely thin, and the gods were active participants in the life of the city. While Lagash flourished culturally, a different city would emerge as the political center of the renewed state. The ancient city of near the Persian Gulf, became the seat of a new dynasty. Founded around 2.112 BCE by a ruler named Ur-Nammu. He drove out the Gutians, reunited much of Mesopotamia, and made his reputation not primarily as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver and builder. The Law Code of Ur-Nammu stands as the earliest known systematic legal collection in human history, predating the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. It established fixed monetary penalties for various offenses, moving away from physical retribution towards standardized compensation. It protected the vulnerable, widows, orphans, the poor, from exploitation by the powerful, and in a detail that somehow feels both ancient and thoroughly modern. It included what may be the world's oldest known traffic laws, right-of-way rules for boats on canals. Ur-Nammu also built. His most visible legacy was the construction of monumental ziggurats, massive step temples rising toward the heavens. The best preserved example at Ur featured 3 levels reaching a height of roughly 30 meters, accessed by 3 grand staircases. These structures, visible for miles across the flat landscape, were at once engineering achievements, theological statements, and political symbols. This city, they announced to anyone who could see them, stands in right relationship with its gods. Under Ur-Nammu's son Shulga, who ruled for an extraordinary 48 years, the state reached its peak of organization and prosperity. He standardized the calendar, reformed weights and measures, created a royal messenger system with relay stations across the empire, reorganized taxation, and standardized scribal education. He cultivated his image as an ideal king through symbolic actions, claiming, for instance, to be a champion runner who personally carried ritual offerings between distant temple cities in a single day, covering over 100 miles. Whether literal or symbolic, the claim conveyed what mattered. Here was a king who unified the realm through his own tireless exertion. Literary culture flourished. Scribal schools preserved and expanded traditional texts. Many of the literary works later identified as Sumerian classics were compiled and standardized during this creative era: creation myths, temple hymns, royal praise poetry, wisdom literature, and one unexpected new form emerged: the royal love song. These lyrical compositions depicted romantic relationships between kings and the goddess Inanna, mixing politics with eroticism to reinforce the theological foundations of royal authority. Power, beauty, and divinity were woven together in a single literary act. But prosperity conceals its own vulnerabilities. Under Shulgi's successors, the state began to unravel. Provincial governors increasingly acted as independent rulers. Nomadic groups infiltrated from the west. And perhaps most critically, the ancient irrigation systems that sustained the agricultural heartland faced the slow catastrophe of salinization. Repeated irrigation in an arid climate builds up salt deposits in the soil, year after year, gradually poisoning its fertility. Grain prices recorded in texts from this period show dramatic inflation, suggesting widespread agricultural collapse across the region. The final blow came from outside. The neighboring state of Elam, centered in what is now southwestern Iran, had been growing in power. Around 2004 BCE, Elamite forces captured Ur itself. The city was pillaged, its ziggurat desecrated, its last king taken captive to Elam, where he presumably died in exile. A contemporary lament describes the fall with a grief that still resonates across 4,000 years, the city defiled. Its people living like ghosts. Corpses floating in the Euphrates that once brought life. One era had ended, the next was already forming in the shadows. Centered on a city no one yet took seriously. A modest settlement on the Euphrates whose name translated as Gate of the Gods. Chapter 5. The Rise of Babylon. Circa 1.894 to 1.595 BCE. After the fall of Ur, political power in Mesopotamia fragmented among numerous competing city-states. No single center could establish dominance, and the landscape became a patchwork of small kingdoms vying for control of trade routes, water access, and agricultural land. Into this fluid political world came a significant demographic shift. Semi-nomadic peoples known as Amorites, originally from the Syrian desert, had been gradually settling across Mesopotamia for generations, establishing dynasties in city after city. One such Amorite leader, named Sumu Abum, established himself around 1.894 BCE in a modest settlement on the Euphrates whose name, Babylon, translated as Gate of the Gods. The city had existed for centuries without particular distinction. Under its new ruling house, that was about to change. For its first century, Babylon remained merely one power among many. Its first 5 rulers expanded their territory gradually, building fortifications, constructing temples, strengthening their modest kingdom. Other cities commanded greater resources and prestige. Then, around 1.792 BCE, the 6th ruler of the dynasty ascended the throne. He would rule for 43 years. His name was Hammurabi. Early in his reign, Hammurabi focused entirely on internal development. Canals were extended, temples renovated, walls reinforced. He cultivated relationships with neighboring powers, sometimes acting as mediator in their disputes, while avoiding direct confrontation until his position was unassailable. He watched, and waited, and built. Around the midpoint of his reign, he struck, in a series of swift, methodical military campaigns. He eliminated his rivals one by one: Uruk, Isin, Larsa in the south, Eshnunna in the Diyala region, Mari on the middle Euphrates, and finally Ashur in the north. When it was done, Hammurabi had united virtually all of Mesopotamia under a single rule for the first time since the Akkadian Empire. 5 centuries before, but unlike Sargon, who had emphasized the revolutionary novelty of his achievement, Hammurabi presented himself as a conservative restorer of ancient traditions. Not a conqueror, a shepherd, a servant of the gods appointed to bring justice to the land. That emphasis on justice found its most lasting expression in the document that bears his name. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black diorite stele 2¼ meters tall, crowned with an image of the king receiving divine authority from the sun god Shamash, contained 282 legal provisions covering virtually every aspect of Babylonian society. Discovered by modern archaeologists in 1901, it stands as one of the most complete legal collections from the ancient world. The laws reveal a complex, stratified society. Different penalties applied depending on whether the parties involved were aristocrats, commoners, or slaves. The famous principle of an eye for an eye applied when parties were of equal status. But monetary compensation was prescribed when someone of higher rank injured someone of lower rank. Despite these class distinctions, the code repeatedly struck the same moral note: protect the vulnerable. Prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. provide justice for the orphan and the widow. Whatever its limitations by modern standards, the code embodied a radical idea that law should be publicly known, consistently applied, and derived from something beyond the ruler's momentary whim. That idea changed the world. Hammurabi was equally formidable as an administrator. Hundreds of surviving letters dictated by the king himself reveal a ruler of striking hands-on intensity, personally investigating charges of corruption among local officials, adjudicating complaints from distant provinces, micromanaging religious ceremonies and construction projects. In religious matters, he elevated Babylon's patron deity Marduk to prominence across the regional pantheon. While carefully honoring the traditional gods, royal propaganda increasingly presented Marduk as the king of gods, a divine mirror of Babylon's new earthly supremacy. When Hammurabi died around 1.750 BCE, he left behind a unified kingdom at the height of its power. But the edifice his genius had constructed proved difficult to maintain without his particular genius to sustain it. Within decades, revolts erupted in southern cities. A new power emerged from the marshlands of the extreme south, the Sealand dynasty, seizing several southern cities from Babylonian control. Mountain peoples pressed along the eastern frontiers. Within 50 years of Hammurabi's death, much of his empire had been lost. The city of Babylon itself endured, growing to cover nearly 450 hectares and housing perhaps 60 to 80,000 inhabitants. It remained one of the ancient world's greatest urban centers. Babylonian culture flourished, astronomy, mathematics, medicine all reached new heights of sophistication. The Akkadian language became the international diplomatic tongue of the entire Near East, used for communication between kingdoms from Egypt to Anatolia. For centuries after Hammurabi, later Mesopotamians would look back on his era as a golden age, a time when justice prevailed and the region stood united. Then, around 1.595 BCE, something happened that no one in Babylon could have predicted. From the north, from far beyond Mesopotamia's traditional sphere, came the Hittites, an Indo-European people from central Anatolia, who marched more than 500 miles from their homeland, breached Babylon's defenses, plundered its treasures, overthrew the dynasty that had governed for 3 centuries, and went home. They hadn't come to occupy. They had come to loot. Into the vacuum they left stepped a people who had been quietly waiting, the Kassites, from the Zagros Mountains, who seized the Babylonian throne and held it for an extraordinary 400 years. Chapter 6. Kassite Rule and the Club of Great Powers. Circa 1.595 to 1.155 BCE. The Kassites are one of history's most intriguing and least remembered ruling dynasties. Originally mountain people from the Zagros range, they had been filtering into Mesopotamian society for generations, serving as mercenaries, settling in rural areas, adopting local customs, long before they reached for the throne. When the Hittite raid created its sudden vacuum, they were ready. A Kassite leader named Agum II claimed power and established what would become the longest ruling dynasty in Mesopotamian history, nearly 4 centuries of unbroken control. From approximately 1.595 to 1.155 BCE, their approach to rulership was, in many ways, the opposite of Sargon's or Hammurabi's. They made no attempt to impose their own culture on Babylonia. They adopted the titles, the gods, the administrative practices, and the architectural ambitions of their predecessors. They renovated the great temple of Marduk. They conducted themselves as traditional Babylonian kings in every respect. In doing so, they achieved something the more dramatically ambitious dynasties before them never quite managed: sustained stability. The political landscape of the Near East during this period looks nothing like the earlier age of competing city-states. Several major kingdoms now coexisted in what historians call the Club of Great Powers, a system of balanced rivalries and carefully maintained alliances. Alongside Kassite Babylonia stood the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mitanni Kingdom in northern Syria, and, rising steadily along the upper Tigris, the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. International relations among these powers followed elaborate protocols. Royal letters, written in Akkadian on clay tablets, addressed foreign rulers as brother, a diplomatic fiction of nominal equality that allowed proud kingdoms to cooperate without submitting to each other. Royal marriages cemented political alliances, with princesses dispatched to foreign courts accompanied by elaborate dowries. The Amarna letters, a remarkable diplomatic archive discovered in Egypt, preserve correspondence between Kassite kings and Egyptian pharaohs, offering a vivid window into this world of high-stakes diplomacy. In one letter, a Kassite ruler complained to Pharaoh Amenhotep III that the gold sent as a diplomatic gift was insufficient. "Gold in your country is as common as dust," he wrote, a magnificently blunt complaint across 3,000 years. He needed more gold for his building projects, and he was not shy about saying so. The Kassites introduced a distinctive approach to land management that would have long-term consequences for Babylonian society. They granted large agricultural estates to loyal supporters through officially documented Kadoru boundary stones, inscribed with the grant's details and elaborate divine symbols invoking curses on anyone who violated the arrangement. This created, in effect, a feudal relationship between the crown and a class of landed nobility. Intellectually, this long era of relative stability proved remarkably productive. Scholars compiled comprehensive encyclopedic lists, organizing knowledge about divine names, medical diagnoses, legal precedents, and grammatical forms, representing early attempts at systematically organizing human knowledge. Astronomical observation became increasingly sophisticated. Court astrologers tracked planetary movements with growing precision, accumulating data sets that would eventually enable the mathematical prediction of celestial events. The zodiacal system, dividing the sky's ecliptic into 12 segments named for constellations, began taking recognizable form during this era. Every horoscope that has ever been written owes a distant debt to Kassite Babylonian astronomers watching the night sky from temple platforms. Despite these achievements, the Kassites were not built for aggressive expansion, and their long stability ultimately became a vulnerability. To the north, Assyria was evolving from a commercial city-state into an aggressive territorial power. By the 13th century BCE, Assyrian forces began challenging Kassite control. Then, around 1200 BCE, the world cracked. Something happened across the entire eastern Mediterranean, something historians still debate with urgency and without full consensus, that brought the Bronze Age international order crashing down. The Hittite Empire collapsed suddenly, its capital was destroyed and abandoned. Egyptian power contracted sharply. Trade networks that had connected the ancient world for centuries disintegrated. Cities across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant were burned and abandoned. Scholars call it the Bronze Age collapse, a systemic failure of the political and economic structures that had maintained regional order for 3 centuries. Kassite Babylonia initially showed surprising resilience, outlasting several of its great power contemporaries. But the pressures eventually proved too great. Around 1160 BCE, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunt led a devastating campaign into Babylonian territory, carrying off cultural treasures as trophies, including, tellingly, both the victory stele of Naram-Sin and the law code of Hammurabi. A native Babylonian dynasty then seized power around 1155 BCE, ending 4 centuries of Kassite rule. The Kassites had governed without drama. Their era would not be remembered as a golden age, but their long stability had preserved Babylonian civilization through a catastrophe that destroyed so much of the ancient world around it. That, in its quiet way, was no small legacy. The world was entering a new age now, the Iron Age, and along the Upper Tigris, a new kind of power was ready to fill the vacuum the collapse had left. Chapter 7. The Assyrian Empire. Circa 1300 to 609 BCE. While Babylon endured its centuries of Kassite stability, another force was sharpening itself in the north. In the land watered by the upper Tigris River, a landscape of rolling hills and rain-fed agriculture. Rougher and harsher than the southern plains, the Assyrians were forging a society unlike anything the ancient world had yet produced. Defined by military prowess, administrative efficiency, and a ruthlessness that shocked even contemporaries, they would build the most formidable empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. And they began, with perfect irony, as merchants. The original city of Ashur, from which the Assyrians took their name, was a commercial hub, connecting Anatolia, the Mediterranean, and southern Mesopotamia through networks of long-distance trade. Assyrian merchants established trading colonies in distant Anatolia as early as the 19th century BCE. Their experience as middlemen gave them something invaluable: deep knowledge of distant regions, their resources, and their vulnerabilities. When the time came to trade in armies rather than silver, they knew exactly where to march. The transition from trading city-state to expansionist empire began gradually during the 14th century BCE. Early rulers asserted independence from their Mitanni overlords and began intervening in regional politics. In a letter to the Egyptian pharaoh, the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit declared himself a great king, claiming equal status with the world's powers, a statement of audacious ambition from a city that had previously been regarded as a commercial backwater. Military expansion accelerated under his successors, with conquered territories organized into provinces governed directly by appointed officials rather than left as autonomous vassals. The institutional DNA of empire was being assembled, piece by piece. The true turning point came with Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from approximately 1.114 to 1.076 BCE. This energetic king conducted campaigns in every direction: north into the Armenian highlands, west to the Mediterranean coast, east into the Zagros Mountains, and south against Babylonian territory. His inscriptions boast of crossing the Euphrates 28 times to fight Western enemies, and of hunting lions as a royal sport, establishing the two defining motifs of Assyrian kingship that would persist for centuries: the warrior and the hunter. Master of both human enemies and nature's most dangerous beasts. After his death, Assyria entered a period of contraction lasting nearly 2 centuries, constrained by Aramean tribal groups and succession struggles. But the foundations for what came next remained intact. In the 9th century BCE, 3 rulers began building on them systematically. Ashur-nasir-pal II constructed a magnificent new capital at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, a palace decorated with stone reliefs portraying military conquests, royal hunts, and religious ceremonies in vivid, relentless procession around its walls. These were not merely art. They were propaganda, calculated to communicate to anyone who passed through those halls the nature and extent of Assyrian power. His inauguration banquet reportedly hosted nearly 70,000 guests over 10 days. The number itself was a statement. The Assyrian army, under these 9th century kings, was transformed into an instrument of terrifying efficiency. Iron weapons had replaced bronze, providing a technological advantage that earlier empires had not possessed. Specialized units, charioteers, cavalry, archers, siege engineers, operated in coordinated fashion. Supply chains were carefully planned to sustain operations in distant regions, and the army could go anywhere and stay there. Perhaps most notorious was the Assyrians' calculated use of terror as a deliberate political tool. Royal inscriptions and palace reliefs explicitly depicted the extreme punishments inflicted on rebels: flaying, impalement, mass execution, the burning of cities. These accounts were undoubtedly exaggerated for effect, but they reflected a genuine strategic logic. Make the consequences of resistance so catastrophic and so well publicized that the calculation of resistance would rarely seem worth it. In its cold arithmetic, it worked. The empire expanded dramatically under Tiglath-Pileser III, a usurper who seized the throne in 745 BCE and implemented sweeping reforms. He reorganized the provincial system, breaking larger provinces into smaller units to prevent governors from accumulating too much independent power. He expanded the practice of mass deportation, moving conquered populations across the empire to disrupt local identities and resistance networks. He reformed the military, creating a larger standing army less dependent on seasonal conscripts. Under him and his successors, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, the empire reached unprecedented size, encompassing most of the Middle East, from western Iran to central Egypt, from the Persian Gulf to central Anatolia. The relationship between Assyria and Babylon illustrates the empire's evolving approach to cultural management. Babylon's ancient religious and cultural prestige made it impossible to treat simply as another conquered territory. Early Assyrian kings maintained a kind of dual monarchy, accepting separate coronation as king of Babylon and respecting Marduk and the ancient city's traditions. Sennacherib broke this accommodation, and paid for it. After years of Babylonian rebellions supported by Elam, he lost patience in 689 BCE and ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. Temples demolished, irrigation systems destroyed, the sacred image of Marduk carried off to Assyria. The shock throughout the ancient world was immense. His assassination in 681 BCE, reportedly while praying in a temple, was widely interpreted as divine punishment for his sacrilege. His son Esarhaddon immediately reversed course, ordering the full reconstruction of Babylon as one of his first royal acts. He understood what his father had not, that ideology and religious respect were ultimately more powerful tools of imperial control than brutality alone. Esarhaddon also achieved what his predecessors had long attempted, the conquest of Egypt in 671 BCE, extending Assyrian power to its greatest territorial reach and creating an empire that spanned 2 continents. The final great Assyrian ruler, Ashurbanipal, presided over the empire at its cultural peak. Unusually literate and intellectually curious, he assembled the Library of Nineveh, a collection of some 30,000 clay tablets preserving literary, religious, scientific, and historical works gathered from throughout Mesopotamia. It is one of history's great ironies that this library was preserved for modern discovery precisely because it was buried under the violent destruction that would soon engulf the Assyrian capitals. Beneath the surface of imperial invincibility, the cracks were widening. Controlling such vast territory required resources that even the empire's wealth could not sustain indefinitely. Subject populations harbored deep and enduring resentments. When Ashurbanipal died around 627 BCE, succession disputes immediately paralyzed central authority. Babylon, under a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar, declared independence in 626 BCE. He proved to be an exceptional commander, and he formed an alliance with the Medes, an Iranian people who had built a powerful kingdom in the Zagros Mountains. Together, they struck at the heart of Assyria itself. Ashur fell in 614 BCE. Nineveh, the magnificent imperial capital, fell after a 3-month siege in 612 BCE. Its palaces and temples were put to the torch. Its walls toppled. A remnant Assyrian court held out at Haran, but by 609 BCE, the resistance was extinguished. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, had vanished with a totality that left its contemporaries astonished, and left a stage newly cleared for Babylon's final magnificent chapter. Chapter 8. The Neo-Babylonian Empire. Circa 626–539 BCE. From the ashes of Assyrian domination arose the final magnificent chapter of Mesopotamian civilization. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, also called the Chaldean Empire, lasted less than a century. But in that time, it achieved a cultural splendor so vivid, so deeply embedded in the world's memory, that it secured Babylon's place in the human story for all time. The foundation was laid by Nabopolassar, who had declared independence from Assyria in 626 BCE and forged the alliance that brought Nineveh to its knees. By the time of his death in 605 BCE, he had rebuilt a stable, prosperous state after centuries of foreign domination. He left behind an army, an administration, and a throne, and the son who would make all of it legendary. Nebuchadnezzar II took power upon his father's death and ruled for 43 years. His early campaigns as crown prince had already demonstrated military brilliance. As king, he secured the western territories of the former Assyrian Empire, extending Babylonian control through Syria and Palestine to the Egyptian border. His siege of Jerusalem in 597 BCE, followed by a more devastating conquest in 587 BCE, destroyed the Hebrew temple and sent the Judean elite into exile in Babylon. It was a pivotal event in the history of Judaism, described in biblical texts with a desolation that has never faded, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion. But warfare was not Nebuchadnezzar's primary passion. Construction was. Babylon under his rule was transformed into what contemporaries, and many who came after, recognized as the most magnificent city in the world. The city already had a history stretching back nearly 2 millennia. Nebuchadnezzar reimagined it on a scale that exceeded anything before it. Massive new walls, reportedly so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn around atop them, encircled an urban expanse of more than 850 hectares. The Euphrates River ran through the heart of the city, managed by a network of canals and quays. Wide processional boulevards, paved with limestone and decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions and sacred bulls, connected the major religious and administrative centers. At the heart of it all stood the temple complex of Marduk. The ziggurat at Tamenanki rose in 7 colored tiers to a height of over 90 meters, the likely inspiration, scholars believe, for the biblical Tower of Babel. Beside it stood Esagila, the main temple, housing the golden statue of Marduk and the accumulated treasures of a world-conquering empire. The royal palace complex matched the temples in grandeur. And somewhere within or near it, according to Greek tradition, were the hanging gardens, irrigated terraces filled with exotic plants and trees. Built for Nebuchadnezzar's Median wife, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. Archaeological evidence for the gardens remains elusive, but the very fact that they became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, celebrated by people who had never seen Babylon, testifies to the hold this city had on the human imagination. Babylon's New Year festival represented the empire's theological heartbeat. During this 11-day celebration, the creation epic Enuma Elish was recited aloud, the story of Marduk's victory over primordial chaos and the establishment of cosmic order. In a dramatic ceremony of ritual humiliation, the high priest would strike the king's face and force him to kneel before Marduk's statue, demonstrating that even the most powerful earthly ruler served at divine pleasure. Power, in Babylonia, was always ultimately borrowed from the gods. Intellectually, the Neo-Babylonian period reached remarkable heights, particularly in astronomy. Court scholars refined observational techniques developed over previous centuries, creating increasingly accurate methods for predicting celestial events, lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, solstices and equinoxes. The motivation remained primarily religious, but the mathematical sophistication involved laid foundations for something that would eventually become science. Private enterprise flourished alongside the great institutions. Some family businesses had developed into sophisticated banking houses, financing commercial ventures and agricultural development through credit arrangements that would not look entirely out of place in a modern economy. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, the empire's hidden weakness was immediately exposed. He had no institutional successor. Within 4 years of his death, 3 kings had been removed from the throne. The fourth, a man named Nabonidus, ruled for 17 years, but 10 of those years he spent not in Babylon, but in the Arabian oasis of Tema, leaving his son Belshazzar as regent. His particular devotion to the moon god Sin had alienated the powerful priests of Marduk. His prolonged absence alienated the aristocratic families and urban elites who needed a king in residence. By the time he returned, the constituencies that had sustained Babylonian sovereignty were deeply fractured, and beyond the empire's eastern borders, Cyrus of Persia was already moving. Chapter 9. The Persian Conquest. 539 BCE. The year is 539 BCE. And 3 millennia of indigenous Mesopotamian civilization are approaching their final act. The agent of change is a man from the margins of the known world, a Persian king whose origins seemed far from promising for world historical impact. The Persians had long existed as a collection of semi-nomadic tribes in the southern Zagros Mountains, subordinate to more powerful neighbors. Cyrus II, later called the Great, came from the Achaemenid clan, which had established a small kingdom in southwestern Iran, nominally subject to Median overlordship. His rise began with his overthrow of the Median Empire around 550 BCE. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Cyrus had been raised in secrecy after his maternal grandfather, the Median king Astyages, dreamed that his grandson would one day overthrow him. Despite attempts to eliminate the threat, the boy survived and fulfilled the prophecy. What followed was one of the most rapid conquests in ancient history. Within a single decade, Cyrus gained control over most of Western Asia, absorbing the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, whose king Croesus was proverbially the richest man alive, incorporating the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, and sweeping across the Iranian plateau. His military genius was real. But what distinguished Cyrus from every conqueror before him was not how he fought. It was how he ruled after fighting. Cyrus developed a revolutionary policy of cultural and religious tolerance. Conquered peoples retained their customs, their administrative systems, and their religious practices. Persian imperial strategy focused on ensuring loyalty and the smooth flow of tribute while otherwise minimizing disruption to local societies. This was not merely pragmatism. It was a philosophy of governance that had never before been systematically applied at imperial scale. As Persian forces approached Babylonian territory in 539 BCE, they encountered a society already deeply divided. Nabonidus's religious policies had alienated the priests of Marduk. His long absence had weakened central authority. Various subject peoples harbored resentments. Some frontier garrisons resisted the approaching Persians, many others simply surrendered. The expected decisive battle never materialized. Persian forces conducted a maneuver of elegant simplicity, diverting river water to lower the Euphrates, allowing troops to enter Babylon beneath its massive walls through the riverbed. The city's defenses, so formidable and so celebrated, were bypassed without a siege. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a contemporary Babylonian text, describes what followed in remarkably undramatic terms. The army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle. After the epic destructions of Nineveh, after the burning of Jerusalem, after centuries of Mesopotamian cities being sacked and populations deported, the greatest city in the world changed hands without a fight. Cyrus arrived in Babylon shortly after and implemented policies that would define Persian imperial governance for generations. Rather than presenting himself as a foreign conqueror, he claimed traditional Babylonian royal titles and portrayed himself as the legitimate successor chosen by Marduk, the god whom Nabonidus had neglected. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed with the official Persian account of these events, is one of history's most remarkable documents. In it, Cyrus describes his peaceful entry into Babylon, his concern for the city's welfare, and most significantly, his policy of allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their religious institutions. For the Jewish community, exiled in Babylon for decades, this policy was transformative. The prophet Isaiah called Cyrus God's anointed one, the Messiah, a title bestowed upon no other foreign ruler in the entire Hebrew Bible. Babylon became a wealthy province within the Persian Empire, no longer an imperial capital. But still magnificent, still economically vital, still culturally dominant. Its temples continued operating, its scribal traditions continued, its astronomers continued watching the night sky. The Persian Empire created by Cyrus and expanded by his successors represented a genuinely new model of political organization. Provinces administered by governors connected by road networks and a common administrative language, balancing central control with local autonomy at a scale never before achieved. Under their rule, Mesopotamia experienced generally stable governance for 2 centuries. The Achaemenid dynasty held Mesopotamia until 331 BCE. When Alexander the Great defeated the last Persian king and claimed the empire, beginning yet another chapter in the long history of the land between the rivers. Chapter 10. The Twilight of Mesopotamia. 539 BCE, AD 600. The Persian conquest of 539 BCE marks the beginning of a long twilight. Mesopotamia would continue to exist for many centuries, some of its cities maintaining habitation into the modern era. But the distinctive cultural tradition that had developed over 3 millennia was entering a process of gradual transformation. Absorbed and reshaped by successive waves of foreign rule, each one leaving its own sediment over the ancient foundations. The Persian period was, by the standards of ancient empires, relatively benign. Achaemenid kings participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies when visiting the city, maintained its ancient temples, and incorporated local elites into their administrative systems. Babylonian astronomical knowledge influenced Persian understanding of the cosmos. 2 centuries passed with cultural continuity largely intact, even as political independence was gone. The more dramatic shift came with Alexander the Great, who defeated the Persian forces in 331 BCE and entered Babylon in triumph. He appreciated the city's historical weight. He planned to make it the capital of his new Eastern Empire and began ambitious restoration projects. But Alexander died in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon itself. At the age of 32, the empire he had built in a decade required someone of his stature to maintain it. No one was equal to the task. After years of conflict among his generals, Mesopotamia fell under the control of Seleucus, who established a realm stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Rather than ruling from ancient Babylon, Seleucus founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 90 kilometers north of the ancient city, a Greek-style polis with grid-planned streets, theaters, gymnasiums, and Hellenistic cultural institutions. Many Babylonians relocated there, drawn by economic opportunity, and the ancient capital's population began its slow erosion. A complex cultural fusion developed. Greek became the administrative language, but traditional Mesopotamian temples continued operating. Cuneiform writing persisted for religious and astronomical texts. Ancient literary works were still copied and studied in specialized scribal centers. Babylonian astronomical traditions influenced Greek theoretical models of the cosmos. A Babylonian priest named Berossus composed a Greek-language history of his homeland, translating Mesopotamian traditions into forms comprehensible to Hellenistic audiences. The ancient and the new were in conversation. Political control shifted again in the late Seleucid period. As the empire weakened, the Parthians, an Iranian people from Central Asia, gradually expanded westward and captured Mesopotamia around 141 BCE. Their decentralized approach allowed considerable autonomy to local authorities. Greek remained important, but Aramaic gained prominence and Iranian cultural elements became more visible. Babylon continued its slow decline, eclipsed by newer urban centers. While Seleucia flourished as the region's primary city, Uruk, one of the oldest Mesopotamian cities, site of the White Temple and the first writing, maintained surprising vitality well into the Parthian period. Its temple complex dedicated to Ishtar remaining active long after many had expected it to fall silent. The Parthian era witnessed the final phases of cuneiform writing, the script that had served Mesopotamia for more than 3,000 years. The latest precisely dated cuneiform literary text comes from 35 BCE. The latest known astronomical text in cuneiform dates to AD 75. And then, silence. After more than 30 centuries of continuous use, the world's oldest writing system simply stopped. This abandonment marked a decisive break in cultural continuity, though many Mesopotamian traditions continued in translated forms through Aramaic texts and oral transmission. New religious communities were taking root in the fertile soil of these ancient lands. The Babylonian Jewish community, descended from those who had remained after Cyrus's authorized return, became increasingly influential in Jewish religious thought. And in these centuries the foundations were laid for what would eventually become the Babylonian Talmud, completed around AD 500, the most authoritative legal and ethical compilation in Rabbinic Judaism. Composed in the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's city. The final major imperial transition came when the Sasanian Persians overthrew Parthian rule in AD 224. Under their governance, Ctesiphon reached its peak as one of the world's greatest cities, the winter capital of a renewed Persian Empire. Its legendary palace with its enormous vaulted hall standing as an architectural marvel that would influence Islamic building traditions for centuries. The cultural landscape of pre-Islamic Mesopotamia was, by this period, extraordinarily diverse. Mandaeans practicing their baptismal religion in the southern marshlands. Manichaean missionaries spreading their dualistic faith. Eastern Christianity establishing important centers. Jewish scholars producing the Babylonian Talmud, and in dwindling temples. The last priests of the ancient Mesopotamian religion continuing their increasingly isolated practices, the last custodians of a tradition 4,000 years old. Their numbers diminishing with each generation. The names of their gods growing quieter and quieter. Then the Arab Islamic conquest swept across the region in the 630s and 640s. After the decisive Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636, Arab armies gained control of Mesopotamia. In 762, the Abbasid Caliphate founded Baghdad, 30 kilometers from the ruins of ancient cities, continuing the ancient pattern of new capitals rising near the remains of their predecessors. The region now called Iraq was reborn as the intellectual and political heart of the Islamic world. The ancient gods were forgotten. The ziggurats crumbled or were repurposed. The cuneiform inscriptions, buried under centuries of accumulated earth, waited in silence for a future civilization to dig them up and remember. Epilogue. The legacy of Mesopotamia. As we step back from the full sweep of this history, the question that has been implicit in every chapter asks itself plainly: what remains? Writing, the most transformative technology in human history, found its first systematic expression in the simple clay tokens and pictographs of Uruk. Around 3.400 BCE, what began as a practical method for recording grain deliveries gradually evolved into a flexible system capable of expressing abstract thought, preserving literature, codifying law, and transmitting knowledge across generations. The cuneiform writing developed in Mesopotamia influenced or inspired many subsequent scripts. And the very concept of writing, of preserving language in a physical medium beyond the limits of human memory, spread from this initial source to transform every civilization that followed. Urban life, the organization of dense communities with specialized labor, civic infrastructure, and complex social hierarchies crystallized in the early cities of Sumer. Here, humanity first confronted the enduring challenges of urban governance: how to manage dense populations, share resources, regulate economic activity, and maintain social order amid competing interests. The solutions developed in these pioneering cities: municipal councils, written laws, tax systems, religious institutions as social anchors, established patterns that would be adapted by countless subsequent societies, including our own. Mathematics and astronomy. The sexagesimal system, based on 60, developed by Sumerian administrators, continues to shape how we measure time and angles today. Every second of every minute, every degree of every circle, echoes calculations made by priests and scribes watching the stars from Mesopotamian temple platforms thousands of years ago. Babylonian astronomical observations, accumulated with extraordinary patience over centuries, gave the world its first predictive mathematical models of planetary behavior, the distant foundations of what would eventually become science. Law, the codification of justice, the radical idea that law should be publicly known, consistently applied, and derived from something beyond the ruler's momentary whim, finds its first systematic expression in the law codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi. Those principles underlie every modern legal system on earth, however distant the connection has become. And literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh confronts mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning in the face of inevitable death, questions that have never stopped mattering to human beings, and that were given their first great literary treatment on clay tablets pressed in ancient Sumer. Perhaps most profound of all, Mesopotamia demonstrated humanity's capacity for cumulative cultural achievement, the ability to build upon previous generations' discoveries, to preserve and transmit knowledge, to adapt traditional practices to new circumstances, to create institutions that outlast individual human lives. The long cultural continuity between the rivers was the world's first sustained experiment in what we might call civilization as a project, something larger than any individual, any dynasty, any empire, something that passes from hand to hand across generations, gaining and losing and gaining again. The relationship between ancient Mesopotamia and our contemporary world resembles a mighty river with countless tributaries. Some channels maintain direct connection, others divide and rejoin through complex networks. Some disappear underground only to resurface in unexpected places. The waters that first gathered in the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates have long since mingled with countless other streams. But they remain part of the great flow of human civilization that continues to this day. In their triumphs and their failures, their wisdom and their blindness, their courage and their cruelty, The people of ancient Mesopotamia grappled with challenges that remain recognizable to us across the vast gulf of time. The specific forms of civilization have changed almost beyond recognition, but the fundamental human experiences, of love and fear, wonder and uncertainty, creation and destruction, remain remarkably constant. The legacy of Mesopotamia lives on in our minutes and hours, in our written words, in our cities and our laws, in our religious concepts and our scientific inquiry. And perhaps most of all, it lives on in our continuing effort to find meaning and create beauty in a world that, like the unpredictable floods of the ancient rivers, remains perpetually changing and eternally challenging. The story of Mesopotamia reminds us that civilization is not a possession. It is a process, not an achievement, but an ongoing project, one that began long before any of us were born, and will continue long after we have returned to the dust from which we came. If this journey meant something to you, if somewhere in these 10,000 years you felt the distance between then and now collapse, even briefly, then I ask one thing of you. Subscribe to this channel. Not as a transaction, but because the stories that shaped our world deserve to be told carefully, completely, and without rushing past the parts that matter. Every subscriber is a signal that this work is worth continuing, and there is so much more to continue. The civilizations that rose after Mesopotamia, the empires that borrowed its ideas and carried them forward, the forgotten histories buried beneath the ones we already know. Subscribe, and this channel will keep finding them for you.